Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Aperture, a premier manufacturer of LED lighting with the industry's greatest variety of fixtures for your complete lighting needs. Aperture recently announced the new Storm family of lights. With LED white light quality that matches natural daylight and classic tungsten bulbs, plus extreme low-end dimming while maintaining color quality. Discover more about the new Storm lights and the complete Aperture lighting ecosystem at aperture.com. Today, we're speaking with the director. Among his credits are The Sweet Hereafter, Felicia's Journey, and Seven Veils. We're pleased to welcome Atom Egoyan. Adam, thank you for doing this.
Yes, thank you. Of course, it's an honor, great honor, really.
I think we'll start with our regular question, which is, how did you get to where you are today? Is this something that's always been in your life, or did you find it later? Where did you grow up? What are your influences?
I started doing theater in school. It was something that became really obsessive. I loved writing and directing plays. I was raised on the west coast of Canada. I was born in Egypt. My parents had met at art school in Cairo. They had a gallery in Cairo. And when they came to Canada, they had this crazy idea that they would set up a gallery in a very small city on the west coast called Victoria on Vancouver Island. And they'd be able to raise a family selling their paintings at this private gallery. Of course, that didn't work out. But I always was aware of their love of painting, and it had a huge influence on me. But I realized that if I wanted to find a means of expression, it should be something different from what they were doing. And there was a teacher at my school who was writing and directing plays for students, and I just thought that was a great model. And that's what I started to do when I was around 13, 14. And by the age of about 16 or 17, I was asked to write plays for other schools because there was
Oh, wow.
a festival. And it was the first time I got introduced to this idea of a festival, I must say, that where people show their work. And so I was not only presenting my own plays, but writing plays for other schools. But here's the curious thing is that when I thought of what I wanted to do for a living, I never thought I would make a living as a theater practitioner or as a playwright. So my other passion was international relations and political science. So when I moved to Toronto, it was to study international relations at a place called Trinity College, which specialized in this. So this is to be in the foreign office, foreign affairs, I suppose. But I realized that I still wanted to do plays. And so I wrote a play for the University of Toronto Dramatic Society, Trinity College Dramatic Society. And for the first time, it was refused. It was my first year and they didn't want to put on my play. And I was devastated. I'd never actually been turned down. And I'd been a very big fish in a small pond. And now I was competing with other students who wanted to put on their plays. So you'll laugh at this, but I thought, okay, well, if I can't do it as a play, I'll make it as a film. And there was
Oh, wow.
there was a film club at the university, and it was crazily underutilized. I mean, at that time, and it's difficult maybe to understand this, but in the early 80s, it wasn't the thing everyone wanted to do. So I had access to film equipment. I didn't know anything about film, so I had to learn about, it was a hand crank Bolex. I also used an Arri BL, and I taught myself how to use that. I taught myself how to negative cut. So I was actually cutting A, B, and rolling the 16 millimeter film. Like they had that equipment, very primitive editing equipment and moviolas. And so I taught myself while I was pursuing this degree in international relations. But really, I must say, about the moment I picked up that camera, I thought, oh my, this is such an exciting thing because this camera can represent the point of view of a person. So if there's a character in the drama that's missing, the camera can play that character. And I guess I have to say that because I was quite oblivious to the filmmaking tradition, I thought I had discovered this. I thought I was the first person who ever understood that the film camera could actually be a character. And this just set me afire. And I kind of informed all these early films. But also, when I began watching films to learn about filmmaking, I gravitated towards filmmakers who were coming from theater because that's what I understood.
Mhm.
Those were filmmakers like
Mm.
Mark Bergman or Fassbinder was really important to me at that time. And I sensed in their work that there was something very observational as well. And that was inspiring to me. And those films left a huge mark. So yeah, I mean that's the other thing is we had an arts council system. So I'm not coming from a family with wealth. So I really had to, if I wanted to make these films, I had to apply for arts council grants. And so I had a body of short films and then I made my first feature. Now, interestingly, that first feature was just shown a couple of weeks ago because the Toronto Film Festival is celebrating 50 years. And they decided to show this first feature, which is called Next of Kin, which I shot in 16 millimeter on a budget of about $25,000, which is what we got from the Arts Council grant. And I actually was very surprised they wanted to show this because it's not, I'm very proud of the second feature, Family Viewing. But I was actually really, it was great to see it in a packed cinema. And yes, it very much, it's the story of a boy, 23, who's in family therapy. And this form of therapy involves videotaping the sessions and having members of the family look at the tapes later on. And one day he goes to the clinic to look at his tape and he's given it by mistake the tape of another family who are first generation Armenian immigrants. Their stories that they gave up their son when they came to the country because they couldn't afford to raise him. And he gets this insane idea that he's going to track this family down and tell them that he is their son returning. And he doesn't look anything like them, but they're so emotionally needy that they project into this boy.
Wow.
And so it is actually, and the performances were good. And I felt I hadn't seen it for a long time. There's an interesting story because our paths first crossed because that film was shown on what was called the Multicultural Film Tour in Canada in 1984, when also showing in that tour was Another Time, Another Place.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Wow.
and I remember watching that film and thinking, oh, wow, that's just way better shot than mine is.
That's nice of you to say so. But
And then I saw 1984, 2 years later, which was magnificently shot. And I've been a huge fan of your work. And of course, I mean, I have so many questions to ask you about theater because I've always found that your lighting approach is very theatrical, but I don't know if it comes from.
oh, really?
Yes.
No, it doesn't come from theatre. I've not really spent much time in the theatre at all, really.
So in what way is it theatrical? I'm curious.
Like when I look at the work that, let's say 1984, or I look in the work with the Coen brothers, well, obviously another director who comes from theater is Sam Mendes, and I look at your work with, but there's an expressiveness, there's an expressive element which is quite heightened. Or I look at Blade Runner, and I just find that there are these moments that look as though they could be on stage. But of course, the thing I've come to understand is that it's the one part of the process that you can't translate because a person who's a lighting designer for stage, and that's a key element. Because I still do a lot of theater and opera. It's really that as I do film now. But that person, the lighting designer, you cannot translate that to the set, right? Because that's the DOP's work, right? So I can work with a costume designer in both theater and film, or I could work with other. But the lighting is so specific, and the communication with the team with who are setting up the lights is just very different. But I just have been really inspired by your work because I do feel that it has this idea of there's an emotional element that comes through in the expressive aspects of the lighting and the very bold choices you've made. But again, I understand that that's not necessarily inspired by theater, I guess.
No, not inspired by theatre. It's funny, my inspirations, far from theatre, really. Are more like from film noir and,
And you work with the same cinematographer, Paul Sarossy, most of the time, right?
Yes.
And so how do you communicate with him about what you want it to look like?
Well, I mean, look, that was a really wonderful meeting. So Paul's father was also a camera person, and he used to have this cable show where he would interview film people, and I was interviewed for my first film, Next of Kin, and Paul
Huh.
drove me back from the studio with my wife, Arsene Hanjan, who's appeared in many of my films, and who I met
Yeah.
on that set. And we struck up a conversation, and he was still a film student at York at the time, which is one of the film schools here. And I had shot my first couple of features with a very close friend of mine, Peter Metler, who's very good at camera operation. All these ideas of being observational were things that Peter just did very naturally. He did it very beautifully, but he didn't light well. I mean, it wasn't his forte. And again, having watched films like your early work, but also seeing the works of Bergman, seeing the Michael Bauhaus's work with Fassbinder, I wanted there to be more finesse and subtlety in the lighting. So I had met Paul at this film lab, which is now obsolete. I just noticed that he was trying different things with stocks, and there was a timer at the time, this elderly person who was about to retire, and he said, the two of you would be good together because he knew Paul's passion, and it was really just this crazy meeting, and we got along, and we both really were excited at that time by the work of there was the Hungarian DOP Laszlo Koltai,
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
because that had just come out, called Time Stands Still. And Paul talked about the use of smoke, and I just thought this was the person. It was intuitive. Like, he hadn't
Mm-hmm.
done much, but I just felt that we could work together. And I would say I understood very early on that he could see light in a particular way, and he could make choices. And this was before we had monitors on set. I just entrusted him with the way it would look, how these films would look. And I was responsible for the framing and the camera movement and the composition even, but really Paul was in charge of everything to do with light. But in some ways, the scripts themselves really lent themselves to a certain visual approach, and in particular, this use of very slow movement and long takes. Paul is a wonderful operator, so we have a very privileged relationship where he operates on all my films. Now, the union has had to make certain provisions for that, and they have, just because we have this legacy, I suppose, where he does operate, and really, including this last film. So I love the way he moves, and he comes from I think the one thing he was doing at that time a lot was working on newsreels and doing a lot of kind of just shooting, like very spontaneous shooting. So he knew how to follow things, and it was just second nature to him.
Mm.
He was able to follow the feeling of what the characters were experiencing, and that to me is so important, that there be this tone that's set, not just through the light, but also through the movement. And that's something that by this point, it becomes quite natural. And I do feel privileged that I've had that relationship. I mean, there was one early film that I had to do for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It was a hockey movie, or the characters were involved with sports, and it was a very good story. I thought a very good script, but Paul wasn't available, and I really felt that I was coaxing the DOP into decisions they wouldn't make otherwise. I also felt that with another short I had to do with CBC, and Paul wasn't available, and we had someone who was used to doing it a certain way, and just I could tell, even though there were aspects of the work that I responded to, it was compositional choices or the sensibility, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
When you're not in sync with somebody. And you can feel that. I think the thing that's fascinating about the camera lens is not only does it convey everything that's going on in front of the lens, but somehow mysteriously, I think it also conveys the feelings of the people behind the camera as well, right? So if it's
Mm-hmm.
shot industrially and there's a lot of people involved in making those decisions, you kind of feel this anonymity. But when it's
Mm.
harnessed with with people who are very committed and who are feeling excited about what's in front of the camera, that's transmitted as well. Do you feel that, Roger, when you're shooting?
Yeah. I think it is. I think that's what you really want to try and keep hold of. And I've always noticed with your work, I mean, your films have got a great variation within them from one project to another. I mean, you take Sweet Hereafter to Salome, or to, Remember or something. They're or Ararat, they're very, very different films in terms of their structure and their kind of the way you're kind of engaging the audience. But they always have this sort of personal relationship between the camera and the subject. And is that Paul's always operating? Are you always shooting single camera? Is it a very small crew? Do you have that kind of intimacy with the set?
Yes, it's always been single camera, except for this last film where I'm using the opera Salome, and it's called Seven Veils.
Right.
And there were circumstances there where we had multiple cameras. We just needed to. We shot that in 19 days.
Wow.
There was the first day we had 4 cameras, which I've never had before. But then we reduced it to a single camera. And yes, it's usually a single camera.
And that was for the opera itself. You're shooting the operas with 4 cameras, which kind of makes sense because it's a sort of proscenium kind of event. Yeah.
But also just because of the constraints of having the live orchestra, we had like one session with them, which was a 2-hour session. And so we really needed to design that quite meticulously and have the camera positions clearly defined. And yes, normally it would be a single camera. And if you look at the first feature we did together, a film called Speaking Parts, it's resolutely a single camera, and it's very and the Adjuster, Exotica, the Sweet Hereafter, those are all single cameras. And I think that the use of these long takes, and really there would not be coverage shot, that would be the take. So that commitment and that certainty, I think it's really important to make that commitment and not have coverage sometimes. And I think the weakest work is work where we've overcovered, maybe, and that's really been the result sometimes of not having the control as producers. I tend to produce my own films, but there have been situations I've worked for other producers with Paul, and other, sometimes schedules change. You're promised a 40-day shoot, you end up with a 30-day shoot, and those are such maddening sort of circumstances. And I find that those are when things seem most compromised. But yes, you're right that we don't always, like the style that we were using on those early films up to and including Sweet Hereafter, we began to play with different ideas. So with ARARAT, we're working with a film within the film, and the style of that film within the film, this historic epic, had certain elements that were quite overwrought or kitschy. So we needed to shoot that, right? But I would say the films, including Felicia's Journey, where I didn't produce that technically, but I had a lot of control. I was given a lot of say, and I was able really for the first time to work with a larger budget. And so we were working at Shepperton Studios, and Paul and I were just so thrilled with the history of that studio and working with this wonderful English crew and this designer, Jim Clay. It was just, we took full advantage of being in a studio. And I'm very proud of the work on that film. And also shooting anamorphically on 35 was just such an incredible experience for us.
And you also oftentimes use the same actors you repeatedly, and that must also be because I think every time you click with someone and then work with them again, you're starting automatically with a certain shorthand and trust already there, and you can go further in a way, don't you think?
Well, that's certainly the case with the earlier films. I mean, where we were rehearsing those films almost as theater pieces, and the actors were coming from theater, and I'd seen them on stage and worked with them on stage, and so there was this real ensemble. And I guess I was inspired by, of course, Ingmar Bergman and these actors. One of my favorite films of his is a film called Passion, or Passion of Anna, and it's really just these 4 key actors on this island that he loved, Faroe Island. And I think that's the other thing too, is it's not only being excited about the actors, but in the space that you're in or the location you're on, right? And how the camera is able to express that. And I look at a film like, this very small film I shot in Armenia called Calendar, and you just feel this sense of landscape and reacting to landscape. And I think that's such an important part of that alchemy that we're talking about. But of course, it's about the performances. Cinema is probably, first and foremost, it's about the close-up, right? It's about seeing a human face that's on the screen, projected on the screen, and how unearthly that experience is. I think of the first time I saw Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc, and just these close-ups of Rennie Falconetti, and just how
Mm.
supernatural that felt, and in the films of Bergman, and it's the way those faces are lit, and how the camera is moving around them. And so yes, most of the early films were on dolly and very steady shots, but then we switched that for a film like Remember, where it's really handheld mostly through the film, and it's very, very direct. But it's Paul always really operating that, and he's incredibly adept and game to try anything, really. It's not as though we're locked into any particular style.
How much planning do you do in prep? I mean, are you shot listing or storyboarding, or are you waiting to the day with the actors?
Well, with the budgets we have, we do need to be prepared. We have to have very clear ideas of what we're shooting and what we need. And especially if they're longer takes, we have to plan that. And we have a way of breaking down the day and into quarters. And there's a certain amount we need to have by that first break. And if we make that time, then that might afford us to get some extra stuff, but never to paint ourselves into a corner, right? So that we're scrambling. Like, that's the thing you really don't want to do. And Paul is also very insistent on light, external light, when the sun is going to be at a particular place, and using dusk in a certain way. So if there are shots in a film which need to have a sense of light outside, but it being dark, he will be really clear with the AD of breaking that down, that we need to have the camera at this place at this time, and never to scramble for that, if possible. So yes, I've never had the luxury of being able to just arrive and be completely spontaneous. I've always had to tell, and it's been interesting when I've had larger budgets, I still have this tendency to say, okay, we'll be looking at this direction, and to tell the production, this is all we need to see. And of course, the designer will always say, well, I'll give you everything. And well, no, we don't need that. And I'm just used to, because I'm the producer, I really don't want to spend the money on something I'm not going to show.
Right.
I do realize that also it does presuppose that when you do that early morning blocking, that the actors are game, right? They're not going to come up with something they want to here, because we actually don't have a set there, right? And and Paul's there, and that's the part where we kind of cringe a little bit, where we see an actor thinking that they might want to be in a part of the room that we haven't actually. So that's always fun.
I noticed we watched Sweet Hereafter again the other night. I was so struck by the shots connecting one scene to another,
the
and you're
transitions,
breaking time, but the way you connect one time frame with another, or how the camera moves off something onto something else and then comes down to reveal the next scene. I mean, how was that all pre-thought out, or how much is done in the editing? I was kind of really interested in how much of Sweet Hereafter actually changed in the cut, if it was really blocked in shooting.
Well, look, a lot changed in the cut, because it was restructured, because a lot of it was built around this letter that the character played by Sarah Polley had composed to the lawyer played by Ian Holm. And there were long dollies and shots where we were moving on her face, where I was leaving space for this letter to be recited. But then when we did the assembly, it became clear that the letter was superfluous. It didn't work. And yet I had these beautiful shots, right? So I don't know if I would have allowed myself to have lingered on her face for as long as the camera does, if I hadn't thought that there was something specific that was going to be told over that face. And have Sarah, who was an extraordinary actress before she became a more extraordinary writer-director, but to have her thinking about those words as the camera was moving. So you could say that really, once I saw what she was doing. And again, it goes back to this idea of how important the close-up is, or how important the performance is, that I could extract the actual voiceover, but it meant that there was a rhythm and there was a feeling to the way the camera was moving. There are a number of transitions which are obviously very designed, where the camera sort of on a helicopter at the time, we didn't have drones, sort of moves up into the sky, and then we're magically transported into the interior of an airplane. And those are thought of beforehand, but they're made convincing by the sound design very often as well, and the use of music, and that again is an essential part of my team. Stephen Monroe has done all the sound design, and Michael Dana has composed all the music for all my films, really. So yeah, I would say with those films, and because I produced it myself as well, there's no interference. I don't think a film like that would survive a test process, which you need to do, obviously, when you're working on a higher budgeted film. I think audiences would always say, well, I would prefer it if I knew what was happening all the time, right? And yet so much of the pleasure and the power of these types of movies is that you have to put it together in your brain, in your mind, and you have to let your thoughts wander a little bit like the film does. I think of Exotica. Exotica was a film where we delivered the film to the US distributor, and they wanted to have a marketing screening. And I remember going to that in New York, and then the distributor, who will remain unnamed, they're in prison right now, but they they approached me and they said, it's going to be much better if we see the end of the film at the beginning, and we have a voiceover as she walks into the club at the beginning and describing how she got there and connected. I said, well, that would make it clearer, certainly, but it would eviscerate the power of the film for sure.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for one particular review that we got in the Village Voice, which really heralded this movie in a way that any filmmaker would dream of, I don't think it would have had the trajectory it had. Yeah, I get nervous about test screenings, but they're essential, of course. I also see that they're valuable. But these early films, they were shot in the fall, and our ambition was to get it ready for Cannes. And Sweet Hereafter, I don't quite know how we got that ready for Cannes, because we shot it in December, and we were able to show a 35 millimeter work print to the selection committee in March. So that was a really cool post.
Yeah.
And I did an opera in Queen. So
So I was really intrigued about also the way the film differs from the book, and noticed that
Sweet Hereafter, yeah.
Russell Banks actually appears in the film. So did you work together on the adaptation, on the film script of Sweet Hereafter?
I have to say no. And when Russell first read the adaptation that made extensive use of the Pied Piper by Robert Browning, he recoiled. Like he did not respond well to that, and he felt it was way too gay and pretentious. But then he loved it in the film. And I will also say that when we're talking about the voiceovers of the letter to the lawyer, that we substituted those with the readings of the Pied Piper. So, that was the other thing that began to emerge as we were working on the film.
Interesting.
It's really wonderful when you can shoot and edit and not have interference, and where you're continuing to discover things in the editing. And you can do that when you work with a very low budget, and where you don't have responsibilities to people who have read a script and have signed off on it, right? And they expect that, where any change or shift has to be approved by the people who finance the film. And I do understand that, but it means that these magical moments of discovery that you might find in the editing room are somehow, there's a conservatism to them, because they need many levels of approval.
Also, I got to ask, it's also about Ian Holm, because that, I think, was his first leading role in a movie, and he was 65.
I'd always had Ian in mind. I think, well, speaking of theater to film, one of my favorite films is Peter Hall's rendition of The Homecoming. And that was an extraordinary piece of work, and seeing Ian in that. And I went to the financiers and I said, look, either we don't make this film, or we make it with the greatest actor in the English language that you've never heard of. So the budget kind of fell a little bit, but we were able to make the film with Ian, and he's absolutely, it was a dream come true.
He's
And he was so,
amazing.
he just was able to work with the Canadian cast, and I'm eternally thankful. Have you ever experienced like a major cast change at the last moment, or?
Well, I know in 1984, the main the character that Richard Burton ended up playing was going to be played by somebody else, but
Right.
actually, I think Michael Radford and I were really glad that it was Richard Burton in the end.
And the
Yeah.
man who wasn't there was originally someone
The
else.
man who wasn't there, Joel and Ethan, wrote it with somebody else in mind. So it's kind of interesting how these things happen. You read about Casablanca and who was meant to be in that originally,
Right.
but
'Cause
I can't imagine anybody else but Ian Holm being in the Sweet
Absolutely,
Hereafter, having watched it so many times.
and he was so thankful that he got to do this lead role, and he was so proud of it. And I do think that, you look at, there's that scene in the airplane where he's telling the story of the spider, and we had
Mm.
Oh yeah.
a rack focus, right? The bellows that is very precise in terms of what the dividing line is. So we were very close on his face, and I said, Ian, you really can't turn your head at all. It was so limiting in a way, but because he's coming from theater and because he's so disciplined, he was able to give this magnificent performance using the most unusual lens possible, right? So that I could keep focus the young woman who's listening to the story, and she's also great, Stephanie. So you're also watching him as she's watching him as well. So that type of craft, that type of precision, I was just so thankful to have Ian. Speaking of lenses, I would say that, I don't know if you remember that film, The Homecoming, but it was shot by David Watkins. And one of the unusual things is that is basically shot on a set, but he was using his usual arc lights and bounces and this incredible. And I talked to Ian about it because it has this very unusual effect, that film, because he's using long lenses, but the depth of field is really extraordinary. So he stopped down on very, very long lenses. And the only way you could do that, of course, in interiors, to have a lot of light.
A lot of light.
Yeah.
He was very famous for using a lot of light, a huge amount of soft light, but a lot of it. And even one of his later films, the set burst into flames because there was so much light.
Right. But here's the thing about that. It makes it very, very uncomfortable for the actors, right? It's very, very hot.
Yeah.
And Ian was talking about that, how they had to be dabbed between every take, right?
Yeah.
You don't see that when you watch the film, but you are aware of this very unusual feeling
Yes.
of having a long lens, but it feels like a wide lens in terms of the focus, right?
Right. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Of course, I don't think these days you'd have so much problems with LEDs. You wouldn't have that kind of heat build up on a set now. But yeah, I mean, I remember David Watkin and his, the amount of light he had was amazing.
Well, I'm curious, Roger, when you say you remember, I mean, did you visit him on set, or do you
No.
each other, or because when people ask me about directors, and I think it's odd because you don't see how other people direct when people ask me about that. But you've been exposed to all these different sort of directorial approaches, and you hear about people behaving certain ways or making decisions, and you just go, that's shooting yourself in the foot. Like, why would anyone do that? Or why would a director suddenly point towards where the parking unit is? Or
Yeah. Oh no, that was
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay. The story of Ken Russell. I knew Dick Bush quite well because he was teaching at the film school, and I got to know him fairly well. And he said on Tommy, they were filming in this big church cathedral or whatever, and he'd lit this huge rig. He'd lit the whole thing, and Ken comes in the morning and said, "Oh no, I think it would be good looking the other way." And Dick said, "Well, that's all my lights up there." He said, Ken said, "Well, that will look quite good, won't it?" And I kind of think, well, are they playing a game or what? It's very weird.
it is very weird, right? And you realize that this assertion of ego, or this idea that the set is sort of a place where you somehow prove that you are making the decisions, like it feels so counterproductive.
Yeah.
And I think it's
it's so strange.
I don't get it, but I hear stories, right? And I just
Yeah. No, I've never really experienced another set, and I've only done the odd film that's had multiple cameras, and I don't ever want to do that again. And I always operate like Paul. So it's a certain kind of film that I've experience of, but I hear these stories.
Well, it also seems very odd to visit a set if you work on a set, because when you're working on a set, you don't really have time to visit. So, and why do you want to be the person that's outside of the community
Yeah,
that you're usually in to
yeah.
come visit a set? It just seems odd.
It does seem but Jamie, you've been on other sets as well. I mean, did you
Yeah,
find that
Roger and I work together.
Yeah.
right? But I was looking. I mean, you had been working in the like before.
Yes, I was a script supervisor for a long time.
So you've
Yeah.
seen lots of different sort of behaviors on set, I would imagine. Right?
Yes. Yes, I have. Yeah. It
Yeah.
doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes.
No, but it does make you realize how lucky you are to have the
Yeah.
relationships with directors that you've had, like we had with the Coen brothers and stuff, and I had that real sort of, the kind of filmmaking you do with Paul, that kind of personal kind of filmmaking,
Yeah, and also just this idea of being able to make sure people don't waste time, right? That you have,
Mm,
it's wonderful when you know what the rules are, what the schedule is, you understand what the limitations are, and you've within these constraints, you're able to play, right? Because you have designed, sometimes storyboarded, sometimes just through discussions, pre-imagining what you are going to need, because it's all about that, right? Being able to communicate the things that you want to have on that set so that the actors will
mm.
be able to do what they need to do. Yeah, I just people ask me about how other directors work, and I really have no idea. One of the biggest questions that comes up a lot is, what if there's an actor who likes to rehearse and another actor who doesn't, right? And so
Right. Yeah.
how do you balance those two things? And yes, that's a good question. And I've been in that situation a lot. And really, it's a way of rehearsing the take so that both sort of feel that they're getting what they need in order to deliver that performance. And it's all about that moment where, if the camera can capture that, and sometimes capture something that's unexpected that the actor is able to generate, that's always so exciting.
I think also one of the most difficult things as a director is when you're shooting something, having the belief in yourself when you see something that doesn't need coverage. Because sometimes coverage comes in handy if you're doing a rhythm in the edit and you want to change the rhythm slightly. But other times you really don't need it. It plays much better in one shot. But to me, it takes a lot of strength for a director to say, nope, let's go to the next one and spend our time on that.
Well, especially if it's action that involves a transition. Like if there's something that it feels potentially forced, or that you need to understand it in real time for it to make any sense, then it's really wonderful to be able to contain that in a master. And again, to have it perhaps where the camera finds itself through movement or through the blocking, that you're on the face of someone who's in that place where they're making a decision. Cutting to someone making a decision is always less powerful, I find, than moving that person into a camera so that we see the decision being made, or having the camera move into that, because you're also, by doing that, anticipating that there is movement happening, as opposed to it just being mechanical, right? But I also think that's part of the when you're producing, you don't have the pressure of. I had this terrible experience early on. I remember I was asked to do the pilot of a series. I was very young, and I won't get into how that happened. And it was a major series. It's one of the reasons why I've not really done much television, was where we had this opening master, and it was like so beautiful, and we spent so much time, and the camera was moving very beautifully around the various characters that would join up later on, and I was really proud of it. And I remember getting the notes back from the executive saying, "Well, that's a beautiful shot, but where is the coverage?" And I went, well, there is no coverage. I mean, you can't have coverage when you have that sort of a shot. And they were just aghast. They said, no, we need coverage. So we had to go back, and it was like, no way, like, really, we have to. And how are you going to cover this? Because it just feels like there's something so graceful and elegant, and to imagine cutting into it would just be like, it would be horrible. And it was the unhappiest day of my life, really, shooting life, where I had to, because of my contractual obligation, go back and shoot something that I knew wouldn't work.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think that what happens is, if you can make that commitment, and people understand that you have that ability to, and that it feels honest, right? That it shouldn't feel forced. Because I think sometimes, masters can also feel showy, right? And you don't want that. You want it to feel integrated, organic. It needs to come from the feelings that you have, that the performers are generating. I keep repeating that, but it's really about what the actors are giving to you, and how you best capture that, and how you get into their state of mind, and try and find a language which shows you how they're experiencing the world. You mentioned Remember, and Remember deals with an elderly man played by Christopher Plummer brilliantly, and has no sense of the past. He's suffering from dementia, and so everything is in the present. So we had to find a way of shooting that sort of felt as though it was in the present moment. There would be, unlike most of my films, there's no use of non-chronological kind of time. It's all moving forward towards this kind of unexpected conclusion. But at all times, we feel that he can only understand the present moment. So we had to shoot it that way. So all those things we were talking about before, about consideration and alchemy, and this sense of foreboding, was we took a totally different plan. And I think it works in that film.
Yeah.
Is that why you were shooting handheld?
Yeah. Handheld, to give it this immediacy, and to give it this feeling of, well, it goes back to this idea, because he's kept speaking about his wife that he's just lost, Ruth. And so I always had this sense that it was Ruth watching him, like, go through this crazy odyssey he goes on. And so that gave the character a certain, like the camera, a certain character. These are decisions that you don't expect anyone to read, but they might sense an intention, right? That there's something that feels committed and focused. Did you find that there are conversations that, as you're shooting it, you're thinking that, well, even if that's not something that the audience or the viewer will understand, it gives a sense of purpose to how that shot is designed?
Yeah, I think you do. I mean,
I'm thinking about also when a shot just feels right. So the shot of pushing into the tree and Prisoners, it made no sense technically. The scene wasn't about a tree, but the sense of tension when this unrelated shot comes in, it really worked.
I really think it's all about an emotional reaction to what you see in front of you, or what you want to see in front of you. If you're drawing on a piece of paper and doing storyboards, or you're on a set, what's actually there. And I find it an emotional thing. I can't really talk about it because I don't sort of intellectualize it,
Yeah, I mean, you look at Prisoners, and you look at, obviously you were shooting in like real, was that a real location, or was that because it felt like
No, the only set was,
you were shooting through doorways a lot, right? I was very aware, so and that really works for the film. But I'm just curious, okay, since again I don't appear on other people's sets, not even Denis' sets. He's someone I've admired as a Canadian for so long, first films. But let's say that shot of the tree. I mean, how is that explained? Like, how did you take time from, must have been a busy schedule, to then do that shot?
Well, there was pressure not to do it, but we all said we're going to do it, including Bruce, a dolly grip I worked for 35 years or whatever. And he said, no, we're going to get to do it. And Denny kept saying, oh, don't forget that shot. Don't forget that shot. But we got it at the end of the day after we'd finished a scene we were shooting. And a lot of people didn't understand how it was going to be used, or why Denny was asking for it.
I find that super exciting, right? Because it goes back to what I was saying before.
Yeah,
You had that time at the end of the day to do that shot. So as you're
right,
scheduling that day, you have this shot in mind so that you can
right,
create the time for it. So the question is, if it was and it ended up being a really difficult day, or you had terrible weather issues, or everything was like really rushed, would you still been able to have done that shot? Was it something you would have prioritized and come back to if you didn't give yourself that time? And that's the big question in filmmaking, right?
yeah,
Is to
yeah,
is to find those spaces that allow you to
Right.
pursue other paths, right? And
right.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think Denny was always very good at sort of saying, well, I can, like he would say, we would shoot a wide shot of a scene and you'd say, okay, we talked about doing coverage, and say, which over do you want to start on or whatever? And he said, oh, I don't think we need them, because he's quite confident in that show. So he would find the time to do things that he really wanted to do by saying, well, I'm quite happy with this. I'm not going to cover myself because,
Which
I mean, obviously didn't feel he needed it, but he was,
which also gave us more time in the
yeah,
day.
yeah. So you might have, if you had more time, you might have shot the coverage just in case, but he would allow himself the
I
time
mean,
to play.
it's just a huge question, right? When you're on a set, for instance, you have characters around a table, and you have that big decision.
All
You,
right.
you can cover it in a master, but if you start getting into singles, then you have eyeline issues, and each of those eyeline
Right.
issues is going to take up a certain amount of time, and you could find yourself a small scene which could have been actually quite adequately shot in a master just ends up sucking half the day, right?
Yeah, or
And
more. Yeah, you can be like 2 or 3 days shooting all the angles and singles, and then
yes,
there's all the discussion about, well, if I cut from this shot to this shot, that doesn't work because the eyeline's wrong. Now we need to shoot this other shot to make the eyeline right for this shot, and you get yourself in such a mess, don't you? It's just crazy.
exactly. Oh my God, you're making me sweat just hearing that story, right? Because I
No, me too. I don't ever want to do it again.
no, but it's and that's what I learned from watching like some of the Fassbinder films was just
Yeah,
complicated group scenes. Michael Bauhaus would just shoot in these masters, and there would just be moving masters, and they would cover it all, and they could just move on. They had very short shooting
yeah,
schedules. I remember I was on a jury
yeah.
in Cannes, and so I was just soaking him for all these stories, and it came down to schedule. Like that's the time they had, right? And it always seemed to be the right choice. Coverage is just, I mean, there are moments where of course it can be very powerful to be on an actor and not see how the other person is responding, right? And to be very judicious about the and so there you would definitely need coverage. But this idea of just covering every character in a group scene, especially if there's movement, it becomes nightmarish, really.
I think that's a lot of why a lot of, dare I say it, a lot of modern films look very much the same because they shoot the same amount of coverage and they feel they have to have everybody that's talking on camera, and nobody thinks about, well, how can I do this in 1 or 2 shots, and what are the
What's the important
essential
shots?
angle?
Yeah.
Who do I need to see in the relationship I need to build up? They don't. I don't know. They just shoot it and then try and cut it and later, have all the options.
But in a way, doesn't this go back to what we were speaking about at the very beginning in terms of theater and proscenium, right? Because
Hmm.
what the camera is doing is really setting up that proscenium, right? And the audience in that theater is making those choices of who they're going to pay attention to and how much time they're going to spend looking at someone, and it makes it very active. So
hmm
in cinema, if you're able to deploy some of that, like not make it stagey, but this idea of real of seeing that these are real moments and that it's not manipulated by cutting.
Right. I want to just point out that very simple shot in Sweet Hereafter where you're in the plane and the camera just moves from a 2 shot to a shot with Ian in the foreground.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of a devastating move, the way it changes the kind of balance of the frame. It's just so simple, but it's so effective. And that's so different than actually doing, a 2 shot at the front and then 2 singles from cross
Mm.
angles and stuff and just do it in the cut. It just wouldn't have been as powerful.
So here's my question though: do you think that if you had all the time in the world, and that if you do that shot, the moving shot, and then you also cover it, does that also affect the performers as well? Like, isn't it important for them to think that this is the moment, right? And that they're,
Mm-hmm.
again, this goes back to this idea of theatricality, because theater is very much about this moment that they're on stage, they're performing. And they have control over that performance, right? They don't feel it's going to be cut or manipulated. That and it gives them it just must look. I look at Ian in those shots and in those scenes. I think he understood that this was how this performance was going to be presented. There was going to be no manipulation of that, and that must through the sensibility. I would think.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember
sure.
on a very early film of mine, the second feature, Family Viewing, I had this idea that one of the character in this very dysfunctional family felt like he was in the middle of a soap opera. So we had this audacious sort of, it was shot on film, but the scenes with his family were shot on tape, and it was live switched like a soap opera. And that was then made into a kinescope at the time, so that it would be cut into the film. And I was really excited about this, right? Because it seemed to me to represent how this character was feeling about his home life. And maybe it goes back to that idea of the video therapy sessions I was saying in the first film. But the investors and one of the major funding bodies at the time said, we'll participate in this project, but we want you to shoot that way, but also shoot it traditionally, so you can make that decision later. And I guess just the arrogance of youth, I said no. I actually turned down the financing because I wanted it to be resolute, that this was the way that these scenes would be shot, that there would be no temptation or possibility of altering that. And the biggest decision after a filmmaker decides what story they want to tell is what budget level you're going to tell it at, because that really determines the amount of control you have. That's super impressive about Denis, is that he's able to make these huge studio films and have the same level of control as if he was working on a small budget, because those films have delivered. Obviously, that they've been able to actually be financially successful. So that gives him that incredible power. He's able to harness that with his vision. But if you were to look at his first features, like, he was always making audacious, bold visual choices, and he really understood how a camera works and how camera movement works and how it works in a sculptural sense.
You were just talking there about ideas and where the ideas come from. A lot of your films have related to your history, your ancestry, I suppose, of Armenia and the Armenian Genocide. Can you talk about that, how important that is to you, and where a lot of your films you've written yourself. I think it's only The Sweet Hereafter and Felicia's Journey that were based on novels.
Adaptations.
Can you talk about that, where the ideas come from?
Well, look, it's this idea of another life you might have had, right? I mean, my grandmother was orphaned by the Armenian Genocide, so we don't know where she was from. And I never met either of my grandfathers, but they were also affected by this historic calamity. And I think this idea of how precarious our relationship to the past might be, especially if an action is denied. Like, let's say in the case of the Armenian Genocide, the perpetrators have never actually admitted that happened or happened that way. So you're dealing with conflicting senses of what is real. And I think that's really marked me for sure in the writing. There's always this sense of like how reality is precarious and how it's often constructed by stories we tell each other and way things are presented. So that in the case of Sweet Hereafter, which is dealing with an incestuous relationship, but I think what was very unusual at the time is that it's being told from the point of view of a victim before she understands the devastation that it's wrought on her. So that it's never really clear to the viewer that what's happening to her is horrifying, because she hasn't understood it as being as devastating yet. She's entered into that phase, and it's very different from the book that way. So if you read the book, that character is angry at her father from the very beginning, wants revenge, to extract something from the father. but based on experiences that I had observed. And I just felt that there was another way to approach it. And so we took this other idea that we would somehow present it as she was experiencing this trauma. And I think that happens again in Seven Veils, the last film. We're trying to understand the nature of how trauma is engineered, but it comes back from observing very traumatized people in my own family, and seeing that those things are very persistent. They are intergenerational. They are passed, because in the case of the Armenian Genocide, one of the things you're raised with is that you have to let people know, like even as we're talking about it now, right? If you talk about that history, it will be forgotten. And I think that informs the anxiety of the character in ARARAT, the young man who's stopped by Christopher Plummer. He went there. He saw. It's strange that we're talking about filmmaking. He was involved as an intern on a film shoot of this historic drama, but he's suddenly wrought with this feeling that the film that he's working on may not be good.
Right. Right.
If it's not good, does that mean that the history is not going to be understood? And that's a crazy thought, that some histories are really vulnerable to how well the filmmaker is able to tell that story. So he goes on this insane quest where he purportedly goes to Turkey to get plate shots so that the historical scenes will somehow be more accurate. But of course, that's just folly. Like, there's something else going on. And Plummer, stopping him at Canada Customs, understands that there's something else in these film cans, perhaps. I'm giving away part of the film. But all of this is part of my own upbringing, and it comes up in a number of the films. It comes up in this play I just did in Berlin called Donation, quite explicitly. I think that the world is full of stories that we don't know about. I mean, especially now, like there's just so many horrors going on. And very often it is the role of film to somehow be able to communicate that. That makes it incredibly delicate and precarious, because the question then is, well, are people going to see that film, or is it going to be successful? Then we get into a whole other. There's so many issues around that industrially, but it has informed me. Sorry, I've just gone on at length. I'm glad you're.
No, I find that really interesting, because I'm just really interested in the way you construct that story with this kid being in this conversation with Christopher Plummer in the customs shed or whatever, and then the film within the film, that you didn't make a historic documentary-ish film about the Armenian Genocide. You specifically reconstructed it in a movie that is obviously a movie, and you see the lights and the actors and the whole bit, which is kind of really interesting. It's
yeah, I mean, it was a bit audacious at the time, because look, the reality was there hadn't been another film about the Armenian Genocide in the time since it was made, almost 25 years ago. There have been 3 films made, one by the Taviani brothers that my wife was in, Arsene Hancan, one by Fatih Akin, the German Turkish filmmaker, called The Cut, that my wife was also in, and then another one with Christian Bale and Oscar Isaacs called The Promise, which is actually a high-budgeted kind of Hollywood film. So in a way, what ARARAT is dealing with makes more sense now, but at the time it was quite provocative, especially for the Armenian community, because they wanted a more traditional presentation of the history. But I think it does. A lot of people haven't seen either of those more conventional films, like for whatever reason. So it raises the question that ARARAT poses, which is, well, is it still history if it's not seen? My feeling is that history is often transformed in the conversations between individuals, so that conversation between Christopher Plummer and the young actor David Alpay is going to change more history in those people's lives than any political gesture. And the other interesting thing about the film is that the only reason Christopher Plummer spend so much time with this young man is because it is his last customs inspection. And I don't think that the young man ever thinks about that. Like, why is this person spending so much time with me? Because he's so consumed in telling his own story. And I found that very touching, right? I found that very touching, and I thought Christopher was so generous. And we really bonded on that film, which is why we ended up working together on Remember as well, because he was so generous with this actor who had never really been in front of a camera, that I picked from an extras casting session, and I just felt that he would be right. It was a really wonderful experience working with the two of them in that location. But I think I do believe that so often, these great big gestures are really communicated by two people who are able to find space to talk and to discuss. And those are the dramas that I find really, I want that sense with the viewer. I want to create that dialogue with the viewer where they feel that there's something interactive. It's not just them relinquishing themselves to what they're seeing on screen. I think that that's a great experience of cinema as well, just to kind of lie back and just let it entertain you. But there are other experiences which are really can go quite deep if you have the right actors and the right team, right, to execute it.
Yeah. I think one of the most striking scenes to me was when the kids with Elias Koteas,
Yeah,
and he's trying to talk to him about it all, and Elias just goes, "Yeah, but did it really happen?"
yeah,
And I don't know why, but that just cut me to the quick.
yeah. Well, I think why that is, again, and that's an actor I've worked with a lot.
Yeah.
And because what we're seeing, like moment of transition where he's open to talking about this history, but then he sees something in the young man that is kind of the young man gives back a quote from Hitler before the Nazis invaded Poland, where Hitler told his generals, "Who remembers the Armenian Genocide?" And in a way, I think what happens is Elias knows that line is something that boy has just learned and is being thrust at him as kind of a provocation.
Yeah.
And you can see that moment where Elias goes from being open to being more hard and actually to take this attitude. And it's horrifying. You see his anger
Yeah.
and you see it sort of shift in that scene.
Yeah.
So so there's a good example. You needed coverage, right? I mean, we we had a nice two shot there, but you wouldn't have had that detail on his face if you hadn't covered it. So
Right.
I'm not. I hope people listening to this, the young filmmakers, don't think everything should be done in master, just because it's we don't all have the budget that Sam Mendes had for 1917, I guess, right?
But you also see it too if you see actual single take productions. It makes me realize why we use cuts, because you'll be on someone and then there's someone over there that you really want to see how they're reacting to, but you can't because you can't swing that far. So those kind of productions remind me, oh, that's why we do takes, because I love long shots and everything, but sometimes you want to be on someone else.
Have either of you seen this English miniseries called Adolescence?
Yes.
Yeah, we
Yes.
talked to the director,
Philip.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, so how do you both feel about that? Because those were all like,
Well, it's interesting because we felt, I've been quite honest, I felt the first episode worked quite well, but the episode between the psychiatrist and the kid in the room, just I didn't understand the movement in the camera on that. I just felt it was really distracting.
so that's a really good like obviously they had this idea. They were like the 4 episodes, 4 shots, right? But I guess that they were locked into that idea, right? They couldn't,
Right.
and so
Right.
here's my
So
question to you, Roger. When you're shooting 1917, are there any moments where you felt you would have wanted to cut, or like that felt
Well, we did. We
I
did
felt,
throughout.
well, I felt when we read the script, we felt we would.
right.
And then talking with Sam, it was interesting because as we obviously we had to kind of storyboard it before we did any of the sets or dug a trench or anything. We had to figure out where the camera was going to go and how long the movement would be. And I remember Sam saying, "Look, if it's not going to work and it's not going to feel right, then we won't do it. Then we'll cut." So we just stuck at it, knowing that the fallback, if we felt we were compromising too much, would be to go back conventionally cut.
But also by dividing it into smaller pieces, it became more manageable.
Yeah, manageable technically, yeah.
And you and Sam sat down in the beginning and said, let's forget this whole single camera thing
Yeah.
right now and talk about who we want to be on when that line is happening.
What do we want the audience to be aware of in the frame at any moment, rather than thinking, how can we keep going?
Have there been times where you would suggest actively to directors that something didn't need coverage, that something was designed to have coverage, that you felt that strongly, and what happens in that situation? I'm curious, like at a higher level, like a higher budgeted film, is that possible? Or
Well, you say that. I mean, I've done sort of, you say the higher budgeted films, but they're all quite intimate and small. And yeah, I mean, the relationship we have with a director is that you can be quite honest about it and say, well, doesn't that work in that shot? But it's usually been actually Denny saying, I think it works in that shot, we don't need coverage, or Mike Radford saying, well, we don't need coverage,
But also sometimes, even when things are planned out, when you do the blocking in the morning, you see that, oh, wait, these shots could actually be one shot. And you do bring it up.
I hope there's been times, actually, when I first started working with Joel and Ethan, we had a theatre, a scene in the theatre on Barton Fink. It was actually the opening of the film. And it was all storyboarded in separate little cuts. And I said, wouldn't it be nice if we just did one flowing move that came down off the sort of flies in the curtain and the guy reading the paper and hooked around and saw the stage.
This was before you guys knew each other.
Before we knew each other. We was first shot we shot on the film. We're going to start. And they said, well, why don't you try it? And we did it. And that's what's in the film. And
So Roger, I find it fascinating because we started the conversation talking about theater, and it's so interesting that here is this very, very famous shot in a theater, and I just would have felt that it was, that decision was made because it was your intimacy with the theater that would allow you to kind of, but you're saying that it's really just because of the energy of what's happening dramatically and spatially. It's not necessarily connected. Yeah.
And also, I think for me, a lot of it, I come from shooting documentaries for many years, so that's why I operate, and that's why I have that kind of sensibility, I guess.
Yeah. So there was a shot near the end of EXOTICA where the tax inspector goes back to the pet shop owner and takes the gun that he knows he has in the drawer. And it's a kind of a dolly on the two of them. The lighting was very expressionistic, and we have this great set with this pet store. And the camera moves on to the two of them, and it was held in this two shot. And it was Paul who said, we might want some coverage here. Like, it would be really good to just, it'll just take a minute, to get these two. And my initial reaction was, no. I mean, this master seems to work, but I was really grateful that he came up with that idea, because I just love being that close on those spaces, but I wouldn't do it. I didn't, that's just the odd thing too, is when you're directing right beside the camera, because I don't look at it, I'm not beside a monitor. I'm very old school that way. So I'm really so wrapped up in the performances and thinking, this is what the camera is capturing, this, that it really does take maybe the second eye who's looking at it and saying, you might want to go closer. You might want to have that. And I think that's something that I know Paul mourns a little bit, that there's this monitor now, and there's a bunch of people, because he really, in these first films, like it is very true that he's the first person to see this, experience this. It's being filtered through him. And then there was that great moment when we would all go to the screening of the dailies. I don't know how we were just young. I don't know how we finished a day of shoot, and then we went to the lab and looked at the dailies.
Yeah, right.
And then, I mean, it now seems unimaginable, but we did.
Yeah,
that was part of the experience. It was quite thrilling.
Yeah. I must say, I used to love that experience where the director was by the camera, and I was operating the camera, and it was about the trust, and that tight relationship. And for the last years, walking from the camera back to wherever the director is with the monitor,
finding them,
watching the replay of the shot, And I'm sorry, but going through my head is, why don't we just do another one? The actors are really into it. Why do we stop for 10 minutes to discuss what the shot is, that we know what the shot is?
Because we just
We
saw
just
it.
shoot it. And
Yeah.
why isn't the director standing by the camera?
Well, I guess you just answered my question when I asked about being on other
Yeah.
people's set, because I can't imagine that. Like, that just feels, and it also
No,
feels
it's-
odd that you're in a place where you would actually the actors would be on the set knowing that you are replaying something. That would feel very
Yeah.
odd
Yeah.
to actors.
Well, sometimes the actors will come back and watch the replay as well, which I think
Which
then
also makes
everybody's obsessing about tiny things in a shot, and you're going, really?
Yeah.
I don't
So
know.
have you had this experience, which I've had now working sometimes with younger actors, where I'm beside the camera and they find that incredibly uncomfortable because they're not used to it? I mean, they're used to having directors in the
Right.
village. And so to have someone that close to them who's not the camera person, some of them, they get intrigued by it, but they're just not used to it. It feels like
That's
it's an ancient
funny.
practice.
Yeah. Huh.
But then the reverse of that, if the director's not on the set and the actor wants some feedback about the shot, the performance, then how many times have I been there and they've turned to me? And I find that kind of difficult because I'm not the director. I have an opinion, and sometimes I'll say it, but I wouldn't say it without the director being there.
That's so interesting, right? Because that
Mm.
goes back to, again, this idea of theater, and that if you're right there with the performer, you are the audience, right? You are the person who's watching that moment. So when I was shooting that scene with Ian Holm in the airplane, like I had front row seats to Ian Holm giving
Right.
this crowning monologue that he'd worked so hard on, and he was delivering so impeccably. Like, why wouldn't I want to be as close to that as possible? It just feels
Yeah.
so counterintuitive.
Yeah.
I had to
Yeah.
pinch myself that this was actually happening at this point. I had this
Yeah. Yeah.
great actor who was speaking this text that I don't know. It was such a high. I just don't know. I understand this idea of everyone wanting to see, the makeup people and the hair people, and I understand how they all want to see their work. But it just feels like there was this obviously an incredible body of films that were made with people just letting go at a certain point, and
Well, the one thing that it is good for is that people never learned what the frame was. So at least they can see what the frame is and stop obsessing over something that's not
Not
even
in
in
the
the
frame.
frame.
Yeah.
or
That's the only thing that
yeah.
helps.
Do you find technically, like when I would look at Felicia's journey, and I think of the hairpiece that Bob had, and the netting on it, which was like so obvious to the naked eye, but which film, because we shot on film quite magically erased the net. And do you find that that's one of the issues, that because I know you're a huge advocate of digital shooting, Roger, and I remember Paul and I were
I
a little,
don't.
a
Yeah.
little shocked when you were so adamant about it, and of course now the technology has caught up. But do you miss any of that? Do you miss any of the blur that film can give, or is it something that you feel can be as easily done with filtering and?
I don't. I'm not really that aware of what you're talking about, actually. But
It
yeah,
depends on how you light
Okay,
it.
well,
You can
yeah.
light
I mean-
digital to make it very sharp.
But what I miss is what we were talking about. I miss that kind of collaboration, that sense of trust between crew members, and not. I don't like the obsession with looking at our monitor on the set. I just find it.
But at the same
distracting.
time, it's also very good to be able to show the director,
Yeah.
I'm thinking of doing it this dark. Are you okay with that?
I think-
Because different
I
directors
think
have different
That's great.
definitions
Yes.
of dark.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
The idea of this is what the shot looks like. This is the lighting I'm
Are you-
intending.
is this what you want?
okay? Because
Yeah.
it's the directors
Right.
obviously should be able to say that rather than watching dailies and then say, "Oh, it's a silhouette. I didn't realize it would be so dark."
Yeah, I mean, so since I'm speaking to the great Roger Deakins, I will ask a nerdy question. So let's say if, for instance, you're toying with the idea of using a pro mist filter now, is that something like I've like shot films on film where I had to make the commitment to use that on the day, right? So it's in the shot, it's baked into the shot. But now I can add that as an effect digitally. And for the most part, it's the same feel. So when we're talking about commitment, do you, given what you can do digitally, do you tend to shoot more nakedly, or are you as experimental with filters?
No, I do it in the camera. I'm not very. I think last time I used a filter was probably 1987, I think.
Oh,
And you didn't
I
like
shot a
it.
film with a filter on the front because I wanted to take the curse off something, and I always regretted it. But I really don't use filters very much. Never have, and I just like trying to do as much as I can just with the light, you know. So I do very little in the DI digitally. I mean, I'm a great advocate of digital because, in a way, I kind of like just sort of saying it's not really about the camera. I mean, we're talking to Anthony Dogmantle next week. He just shot a film on an iPhone. You know, I don't think it matters. It's what's in the frame. It's the frame. It's the light. That's what's important. It's the relationship between the filmmaker and what's in the frame. I find there's too much obsession about technology, whether it's film or digital or IMAX or, you know, I just find these conversations all a little bit. They kind of show up modern filmmaking because the modern filmmaking doesn't have a lot to say.
yeah.
So it's talking about technique instead about, you know,
Content.
story content.
When you shot like oh brother, where art thou, right? You were aware that you would be able to do these manipulations digitally later on.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was a big exception. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely the exception. It was the first time we used the process.
It was also
because that's what the only way we could do it.
the only way you could get what you were specifically
Yeah, we
looking
just
for.
couldn't do it photochemically. Otherwise, yeah, I wouldn't have gone down that route if we'd have kind of
It was
been able
awful.
to do it photochemically because it was a real nightmare. But yeah,
But you were also like one of the first people to use silver bypass, right? So you were also
yeah,
you were chemically very like
yes,
so. I'm just curious.
yes. But that again, that was like a very that was a decision. Yeah, that was the decision before shooting a foot of film. You know, yeah, that was the look. I mean. The same with Oh Brother. I mean, we knew that we were going to do that later. It was all preconceived. It wasn't something we just, you know, threw in and tried as we went along. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's again about just having those discussions beforehand and making.
Yeah.
And it's always that balance between, like you were saying with Sam, like if you feel like you need to cut, then not being locked into something that's we can't because we made this promise to ourselves.
Right.
There are always things that will just be provoked by a composition you find or something that happens during performance. That's part of the beauty of filmmaking, right? Is that
Right.
you're able to surprise yourself.
Yeah. Even within that, in 1984, obviously we blocked everything out and we shot it all in sections because we were different locations for one, so we couldn't do it as one take as some people do. But even within those takes, sometimes there were changes on set. You know, something would happen on the day that you would sort of decide, oh, let's do a movement here so we can come into a close-up or see this in the background at this particular point. So in that sense, it wasn't just kind of like, you know, a technical exercise, you know, which would have been death, I think.
Well, what do you make of this tendency now on some sets? I've heard about it. I've never been on a set where they're shooting at such high resolution that they're keeping very wide masters, and they're then kind of cutting later on through the master. I mean, it just seems to me like that's antithetical to filmmaking. But I mean, I guess.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I don't know if I don't know if I've seen anything where it's been done, but I've heard that's what couple of directors have talked about. Yeah, I don't find that very interesting at all.
No, I mean it's a bit like also like I think some of the scenes in SWEET HEREAFTER, which I'm most proud of, are shots where we have a dolly, and then as we're going into the coverage, we're also dollying and keeping the same movement, right? So it's a steady
Right.
movement going into these close-ups that you can intercut with it, but there's now a tendency to kind of do these digital zooms, right? You know, which I just find so like it somehow breaks the spirit of something that feels physical.
Yeah.
You can feel,
Yeah, right. It feels physical. I think there is a difference between a camera moving, looking like a zoom, and a zoom lens zooming in. There's a different idea behind it. I mean, there's a reason sometimes to use a zoom lens rather than the track, but then I think it's something that you need to consider when you're doing it,
right.
not make up in the cutting room. But yeah, maybe I'm old-fashioned like that. Soon it'll all be the whole scene will be scanned with the actors and everything, right? And you'll have it as a file, and you'll be able to put the camera in later, and you'll be able to shoot it after you've done your stage play.
Yeah. It's just so inspiring to hear you speak this way, right? Because I just feel like there's a tradition that is really important to me, but I somehow feel like there are elements of it that are being diluted. I mean, you were speaking before hesitatingly about how a lot of films look the same now, but I do think that there are these kind of like post-production supervisors and people who are sort of serving, I don't want to get to like, but let's say it's streamers or people who have organized an idea of algorithmically how people watch films, right? And it's just this blandness. It's really bland, and it's kind of depressing to watch most contemporary film.
Yeah. But it's also this whole idea that okay, we've got this wonderful technology, digital cameras you can rate at 25,000 ASA, and so we don't need to light something, which you don't for most part. You can shoot anything you can see with the eye for sure. But then is that why we make films? Is that why people like James Wong Howe actually lit a shot?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's you're kind of throwing away a whole kind of expressive
level of storytelling.
Yeah, level of storytelling, I think. But then,
so you just hope that as people watch those earlier films, they have a clear sense of how they were made, and also, first of all, just the sheer bulk of the cameras that these people had to work with, right?
Yeah,
Like
I
mean, you look at these incredible tracking shots, like Touch of Evil, like that first shot.
Yeah,
like how did we this camera that point? Yeah.
Or even before that, Red Badge of Courage, which was what, early 50s.
Right.
I mean, that were the first really long tracking shots that anybody had done in Hollywood. And that was kind of amazing. Yeah. As you say, huge cameras. And
do you feel like that there is, like when you talk to young filmmakers, that they are aware of the actual, like, is it important to understand how film worked? And so are we completely letting go of that? And I guess my question to you is, once you made the conversion, were there any projects that you might have thought you would have wanted to shoot on film? And why that would have been? I don't know if there were. Maybe I'm just.
Well, there were. I mean, but the last film I did with Joel and Ethan was Hail Caesar, and that was on film. And they wanted to shoot it on film because of its period quality and everything else. And which is kind of fair enough. I got no problem shooting film. I just think it's, I don't know, economically and everything else, it makes more sense to shoot digital personally, but I got no problem if
Also,
somebody wants to
from
do
a
that.
practical standpoint, there isn't the
The
same kind
backup
of
and everything.
backup on film because all of the great technicians have gone into digital now. And when you shoot film, if you have an issue, it's a big thing to try and figure it out because you just don't have that structure anymore.
Yeah.
I will tell you a horrible story. So there was this film I made in the mid noughts where not only did I want to shoot it on film, but I insisted on negative cutting to make the print off the original negative. And I was really adamant about this, and we delivered it, and I'll never forget this call I got from the lab, and they said, "You really should get down here." And I saw the first answer print, and there was so much dirt and sparkle on it, and I couldn't believe. And I called the negative cutter who had cut all my films, and I said to them, "I mean, you were cutting in that vacuum space that we work on, right?" And they sheepishly said, "No, I gave up that space, and I could see that you wanted it cut."
Ah,
And I realized at that point that the pride that I was taking in the fact that it was negative cut was not shared by this person who
Wow.
I projected into them that they were this craftsperson that would have, lovingly gone back to this old technique,
Wow.
but they weren't.
Oh,
Someone who was always doing it
wow.
as a job, and now did it, but not with the same standards. And the
Yeah.
Yeah.
irony of it was, after insisting that this be negative cut, we had to digitally rescan it all so that we can clean up the mess. And I think
Wow.
never again, right? That
Mm.
I gather that Christopher Nolan actually has, like, there are negative cutters and people who are still really maintaining
Yeah.
standard, but it really, and the other thing that's terrifying is when you're working anamorphically, right? Because the splice is so thin, it has to
Yeah.
hold. So I just don't know
Yeah.
who would do that now, unless you had people who are just dedicated to it. But that's the issue when you talk about support, right? It's you
hmm
you're a little bit on your own.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Definitely.
Mm. Can I ask you just lastly,
Yes.
do you feel, how do you, you basically, most of your life, most of your film career, you've worked in Canada on Canadian projects. You've not really taken the Hollywood route. How has it changed? Do you feel you still have the kind of flexibility within the Canadian film industry to make the films you want to make?
I was very, very fortunate in the first part of my career that there was a film company here called Alliance, who were effectively, they were releasing the films, they were doing this sales agents, like, to sell it in foreign territories, so that we had this rhythm, and it was really wonderful. So every couple of years, I could make a film, as long as it was within a certain budget. And then I got involved after the success of Exotica. It was the first time I had to deal with a studio, and because I had an agent, and there was this project with Warner Brothers, and I just thought it would be the right thing to do at that point, and certainly there were things that were appealing about it. But what happened was, it dragged on as we were trying to cast it, and I had already optioned the Sweet Hereafter, and I had made a promise to Russell Banks that I could make this film in the Canadian system, because he had
hmm
optioned it to a studio, and it could never get made in that as a studio film. So I walked away from it, from the Warner Brothers film, so I could do the Sweet Hereafter, and it was a smart thing, because that film, and all the executives were like, "How can you do this? This is it's a greenlit film," and well, it wasn't really, and that film never got made. And
Oh.
and I went, "Oh my God, if I'd given up Sweet Hereafter to do this film that never got made." And there were also really interesting politics around it, which I didn't understand at the time. I was quite young, and I'd signed a pay or play contract based on the approval of a list of 10 actresses that they gave.
hmm
I found out later on that all 10 actresses had previously passed on that project. So it was quite cynical, and they thought that somehow, because I was the flavor of the month, that I was going to reignite their interest. But I didn't understand
Wow.
the machinations happening. So I left the project, and I went on to make The Sweet Hereafter. And then, of course, that film was nominated for Academy Awards, and I was up against Titanic. So it was actually a wonderful opportunity to enjoy the ceremony, because I knew I wasn't going to win. But directed by a fellow Canadian, James Cameron, from Kapuskasing,
Uh-huh.
Ontario. So after that, there was another studio project, and again, it was a very well-known producer, and that film was cast supposedly, and I was going through this process, but then this invitation came from Icon Productions to write and direct a project, because they really had responded to this Sweet Hereafter, and to have total freedom. So I walked away from that project as well. So I just maybe haven't been that lucky. And the only regret I have, maybe, is after Felicia's Journey, which also, got a certain amount of attention, which was made outside of Canada. We shot that in England, Birmingham. Actually, I think we might have been the first feature film to shoot in Birmingham, which was known for television. And I was just so
Yeah, right.
by all these canals, and the the feel of that city. I remember, I'll never forget Bob Hoskins having to learn a Brummie accent. And the crew were completely despondent that he wasn't doing his Cockney thing, right? And because I think
Yeah.
English don't like the Brummie accent, right? There's something about it that just grates them, but I found it really interesting. And you know the story, right? It's
Yeah.
the coal mines that they used to
Yeah.
breathe through their nose, so they would have this other sort of. Anyway, I won't get into the details of it all. But the point being that film also attracted certain attention, and then I got to write an original script for Universal, and the executive was really I come in to pitch an adaptation of a book, but I had this other idea, and the executive said, "Why don't you just go with that idea and write an original script around that idea?" And it was so exciting. And I wrote this. I really loved this script, and it was very ambitious, and it was taking place all over the world, and because it was she had been involved with the Born Identity franchise. But then this opportunity came up to make ARARAT, which was absolutely, it was going to happen because I knew the producer. They had found this pocket of money, and it was a film I was destined to make. So I did say to Universal that I would have to do this other film. And so, of course, by the time I finished that film, that executive had left and everything had changed. And that opportunity, not to say, and this I have to keep reminding myself, it's not that film would ever been made, right? I think
Right.
Denis and his trajectory, he was very fortunate that I think Prisoners was actually being made. Like that was determined to go. And so if that works for you, then it's wonderful. But I think we also forget there are lots of filmmakers who get lost in that system because of things that just, even if they're technically green lit, there's always some snag, right? And I look at my career, I'm just very grateful I've been able to do all these films outside of that system. And of course, you could then use that system for distribution and to get the films out there. But it's a whole, I've had an independence which I really treasure. I look at it and I'm just I'm nothing but grateful. And I think you also have to be honest with yourself. I'm realizing that at this stage is that, I don't know if I was ever destined to make those commercial films. I don't know if I have that particular sensibility, to be honest. I appreciate those films, but I think the people who make those films at a successful level love those films. And look at Denis, and he loved Blade Runner, right? And Dune. He walked onto the set with his tattered, copy of Dune that he had as a teenager, right? He was obsessed with those stories. So they're a perfect marriage of like sensibility and talent and drive. And I've just always been driven to tell these oddball stories. Like, the novels that I've adapted, like between Sweet Hereafter and Felicia's Journey, these are great writers, Russell Banks, Trevor
Preston.
So it just sort of like, I feel like privileged that I've been able to make these films. So I think, as we all know, those moments where you're able to feel gratitude as opposed to resentment are the happiest moments. And we have to kind of keep those treasured, right? Especially in crazy, because you can't, it's dangerous to compare yourself, right? It just feels like you have to know what you have to be true to yourself. And I'm happiest when I'm on a set and I feel like I have some control. I'm working with people I enjoy working with, and we're just allowed to do what we love doing, and hopefully that communicates to the viewer, right?
Right. Well, I hope you continue doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Many years. Yeah, we look forward to
your
your
films.
films all
Thank
the
you so
time.
much. Thank you. And this has been such a privilege.
If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.